Welcome back to our Research Rumble. This is your host, Omri with Black Researchers United. We are here doing our live Q&A session. For those who have not been following us these past couple weeks, we've been hosting a research discussion, and the subject of this discussion is African participation and resistance in the time of slavery. Once again, the topic, African participation and resistance in the time of slavery. So we started out this discussion, the first week we spoke to the question of, did African people sell other African people into slavery? Did Africans sell other Africans into the slave trades? This, of course, as many of you know, is a very contentious question. It's something that we've dealt with I myself in a series of articles on the subject. But we wanted to really engage with the community and, with the followers of our platform to see if there are any questions that you may have on the subject. It's one thing to really just do the research and to to just talk about it and to share some information, and it's another thing to really engage with the people who really need to learn these things, or rather round 3 I should say, because this is the final round. The third round we discussed the question of how did traditional forms of servitude in African societies differ from forms that were practiced by other people in other societies. So for the first round, the first question, we had Brother Adam Myrie. He was with us as we discussed the question of whether or not African people sold other African people into slavery. Brother Myrie, as I did mention during that, very brilliant researcher. Highly recommend that book. During our second discussion, we had Brother Myrie join us again, and we were also joined by Brother Abba. Brother Abba, he identifies as a Maroon, and he is from the island of Jamaica. He and Brother Myrie addressed the question of whether or not African people did enough to resist enslavement. So during this discussion, we covered a range of topics. We spoke about, of course, the resistance to the slave trade on the continent of Africa. We spoke about the resistance which took place on the ships as they sailed into what was then referred to as the New World, the Americas. We spoke about the resistance which took place once the African people reached their destination. There were, of course, certain rebellions and revolts which took place in the islands of the Caribbean, in South America, Central America, and also North America. All of these different forms of resistance, they simply cannot be ignored. And what we did is we went in depth. We tried to explore what were some of the factors which either enabled resistance struggles to progress or prevented them. And in some cases, even before they were able to take off. These are subjects of rather aspects of this subject which are very important for us to delve into, for us to get a better understanding. Brother Abba, he spoke about, of course, the Maroon communities that were established, and particularly in the Caribbean, and how African people defended these communities. At the same time, we did speak about the different politics that was involved in those very struggles. The third discussion, which we had last week with Brother Dwayne Wong Omowale, another published author, that discussion was about, again, how traditional forms of servitude in African societies differed from the forms that were practiced by other people in other societies. Brother Omowale, he has done quite a lot of research on the subject of African history in the diaspora and on the continent. I have two of his books here that he has written. He wrote this book here. It's called One Caribbean and Other Essays. There's his picture there on the back. And we also have his book, Essays Towards Restoring the African Mind. It's a collection of essays that he wrote. And again, there's Brother Dwayne Wong Omowale's picture there on the back. So I'm just going to open the floor for some questions. I know that some of our viewers, those of us who have been following the discussions, I'm sure you have some questions that you would like to ask. You maybe want to get a better understanding of some of these different aspects of the subject. Again, we are talking about African participation and resistance in the time of the slave trades. So, if you have any questions, feel free to post them. You can go ahead and leave them in the comment section. You can leave them anonymously, or you can just identify, maybe a little background that you have on the subject, or maybe if you are just curious about some of the information that was discussed during our previous discussions, feel free to ask. Feel free to ask for some clarification. Feel free to ask, maybe about some reference materials that were used during the discussions. You can also ask about how our discussions were structured. During this rumble, this is the very first research rumble that we have had, we decided we were going to do this during Black History Month. Of course, a time when most people have an interest in learning about Black history, at least in places where Black History Month is observed during the month of February. And so, again, we decided, hey, this would be a great opportunity for us to really address one of the most important subjects of Black history. Not to say that this is the most important, because of course Black history does not start in slavery. It doesn't start in a situation of oppression, and rather, as we pointed out during our first discussion, there was a point in time when the people of Africa were at a very high stage of development, and as a result of the processes which took place during the time of the slave trades, which involved the forced removal of people from the continent to other parts of the world, that was a process which unfortunately led to an underdevelopment, a process in which the situation of the continent was of devastation, and it was of very immense proportions. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I'm just going to give us a moment here, and I'm going to just watch the comment section. Let's see if we have any questions. right, just to get an idea about, I guess, the level of understanding or level of knowledge that our viewers have on the subject, I'm going to just leave a poll, and you can feel free to submit your response to that poll. The question I'm asking is if we have a good understanding based on our research, based on the books that you've been reading on the subject, any articles, maybe you've been listening to some lectures by scholars on the subject of, again, African participation and resistance in the time of the slave trades rather. The question I'm going to ask is if we understand, based on the previous discussion, how traditional forms of servitude in African societies were different from those forms which were practiced by other people in other societies, and even on the African continent when they came to the continent. So, of course, you can just go ahead and leave your response there, yes or no, or if you need more research, maybe you're just not so sure, you can also leave that response. So once again, for those who are just joining us, my name is Omri. I'm here with Black Researchers United, and we are having an open Q&A session. If you have any questions on the subject, which we have been discussing this month during our Research Rumble, the question that we are asking in the poll is in regards to the previous discussion that we had. During that discussion, Brother Dwayne Wong Omowale was with us, and we were asking, or rather we were addressing the question of how traditional forms of servitude in African societies differed from those in other societies. And so, again, if you have any idea of, based on that discussion, how you understand the subject, you can just go ahead and leave a response there. And if maybe you're not sure, maybe you need to do more research, or maybe you'd like us to really revisit that topic, you can also leave a response there, and we'll be more than happy to address any questions that you have. Okay, and while we are waiting to see if there are any questions, I'm just going to go ahead and share some of the references that you can explore as you try to get a better understanding of this subject. These are references that I have used in my research, and I'm sure this group of books that I'm going to introduce here may be helpful for you as well, as you try to get a better understanding of history and how this history is still relevant in our current time. So I'm just going to share a few of my reference materials. As you can see, I have a shelf here which is full of books. I'm just going to pick out a few. me here a stack of books, and I'm just going to go through these books here one by one. So once again, during our research rumble, which we started the first week of February, this month is observed as Black History Month in the United States and in some other countries as well. The first question that we addressed in regards to the overall theme, African participation and resistance in the time of slavery, the question was, did African people sell other African people into slavery? As I mentioned before, the first thing that we have to understand is that slavery is not the defining point of Black history and the history of the African continent. While it did have a large effect on the continent itself and the development of African societies up until the present day, we have to understand that there was a history prior to the transatlantic slave trade, prior to the Arab slave trade as well, that African people had established civilizations which had endured over long, long periods of time. So I want to introduce just some books here that speak to that. This book here, African Archaeology, this book is by David W. Phillipson. This book, I have read it, and I must say that there is a lot of information here which deals with the history of not just African people, but the history of mankind. How, first of all, for some time, academia was saturated with scholars who were they were racist. They had a very hard time grappling with the fact that African people were equal. They were human beings just like everyone else, right? Just like themselves. And so because of that, there were a lot of falsehoods which we find as we read some of the material that were produced by these scholars. This book here seeks to expose the evidence of life in Africa, on the continent of Africa. Again, the fact that it was not just African societies that we can observe in the archaeological record, but really human societies from the very earliest point in time. So life, of course, we understand human life began in Africa. That is the argument that Phillipson makes based on, of course, the overwhelming evidence that is available to us today. He does acknowledge, of course, that with new discoveries, this information can have an impact on our understanding of history, but he makes it very clear that all signs point to the fact that not only did life begin in Africa, not only did civilization begin in Africa, the development of humans as a species, but also the intellectual development of human societies began in Africa. Human culture began in Africa. There are so many things that we can speak on in regards to civilization and the African continent. So this is a very important text that I would recommend. There's another one which also speaks to this. It is the book The Civilizations of Africa, A History to 1800 by Christopher Ehret. This is a very, very good text. Mr. Everett Eret, he also talks about the the fact that the earliest human civilizations can be found in Africa, right? Again, as Phillipson makes the point, life itself began in Africa. So this is another great book I would definitely recommend for those who are interested. I see Brother Myrie, he is joining us. Um, I'm going to just go ahead and I'm going to bring him in. Hello, hello.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Brother Myrie?
I'm all right. Sorry, got a little tied up. Family was having dinner and all that stuff, so I just needed to deal with that, and now I am here.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's good. It's good to have you again, Brother Myrie. I was just talking about some of the discussions that we've had over the past few weeks in regards to African participation and resistance in the time of the slave trades. Um, Once again, for those of you who are just joining us, this is Brother Adam Myrie. He is an excellent researcher. He is also a published author. He has written a book which I have here. Let me see if I can just bring it up on my screen. Yes, so his book is Songs of the Sunya, Tales from the Sands of Time, Volume 1. This is just the first in a series which he is continuing to develop. So, Brother Myrie, I was just introducing some of the reference materials that I've used in my research on this particular subject. Um, so, as we continue, there's a book here, Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. This is a very important book to read. Um, During the time that Walter Rodney wrote this book, a lot of scholarship was constructed to basically indicate that Africa as a continent was, basically lacking in development. And it wasn't until the Europeans came and they started to introduce certain things to the continent, certain ideas, for example, Christianity, some of the technology that they um, had developed, including, of course, the weaponry and um, the different techniques of war. Uh, the scholarship was indicating that, well, it wasn't until those things came along that African societies really started to develop. But Walter Rodney, he makes a very good argument in this book that the slave trade was one of the devastating um, uh, periods of African history, and the subsequent colonization of Africa, which was enabled by the slave trades, um, is something that we simply cannot look to and say, well, this brought some kind of a benefit to the continent. And then there's the book Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. Very good book, I would recommend, of course. He speaks to the economic impact of the slave trades and just how that continues to impact us in the world today. And finally, this book here, Fighting the Slave Trade. I did manage to get my hands on this one by Sylviane Diouf. There's her picture there on the back. So this book speaks to the second round of our discussion, which was, did African people do enough to resist the slave trades? Rather enslavement during the time of the slave trades. So again, this is another book I would highly recommend on the subject. So Brother Myrie, we are here for our Q&A. We are just addressing any questions that our viewers have. I'm just monitoring the comments here to see if we have any questions so far.
All right.
Okay, so there is a question that I have based on our prior discussions, Brother Myrie. The question that I want to see if maybe you are able to speak to this question. It is this: what was the role of women and children during the resistance struggles,
Mhm.
what was their
Well,
role?
let's
Because a lot of times we just kind of talk about the wars. We talk about the you know uh, the warriors, which you know sacrificed from the continent across in the ocean and in the Americas. So my question is, what about the women and children? Were they a part of that struggle, and to what extent?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is absolutely. Women and children were part of the struggle. And to exclude women from the position of warriors, in my view, is factually incorrect. I mean, we have leaders like Nanny of the Maroons, Carlotta Lucumi, La Mulatresse Solitude, and all of these women led phenomenal, resistance movements. Nanny of the Maroons leading the Maroons in 2 wars against the English. You have Carlotta Lucumi, who led a huge rebellion in Cuba. You have La Mulatresse Solitude, whose last words were live free or die. And she fought a battle with the French while being 8 months pregnant. Definitely, we cannot argue that women were not involved as warriors.
Hmm.
But secondly, we have to look at it as a collective struggle. So when machines were being destroyed, it wasn't just men who were doing the destroying. Women were part of that too. In the movements where slaves were having uprisings, women were in those ranks.
But by the
When
machines, you're referring to like on the plantations, for
yes,
example, like uh, the cotton
the
gin,
cotton gins,
yeah,
sugar,
those kinds of
the sugar machine, yeah.
yeah, the
So
the uh, the ones that they had in the factories, the mills, yeah. Okay.
right, exactly. So if you're destroying the gears on a sugarcane processing machine, it wasn't only men doing that. Then, of
Right.
course, you have acts of espionage. There were women who volunteered to basically re-enslave themselves during the American Civil War, for example, to get information for the Union
Right.
to fight against slavery. Children would have been in some of the same roles. Children would have been used to gather information and then pass it on to adults who would be able to use that where possible.
Mm.
So, in terms of women and children being involved in fighting the resistance, it was an all hands on deck type of situation. This isn't to say that every single slave and every single plantation and every single country was, involved, because there's no factual evidence to provide that information. But what we do know is that for the resistance movements that we do know about, women and children were part of that entire process.
Wow. Wow. That's. I think that's powerful to know because you know for a lot of history, rather the historiography of history, right? That just kind of process of historians writing based on the available evidence, or rather selecting some of that evidence to record for us to understand. Um, for a lot of that, women are pretty much they're almost silent. Um, I've read some texts by scholars who are women who make a great deal of this to identify the fact that, well, um, the fact that the society which the African people encountered in the Americas was so patriarchal. It was a society in which, of course, the enslaved were not allowed to have a voice to begin with, right? But as you know, on top of that, women they also faced another level of oppression, to the point where we don't find a as much, I would say, written material, which is firsthand by women. A lot of times, even the males who recorded some of what was happening during this time, they didn't necessarily prefer to include women when recording some of the experiences of the enslaved. So these are, I think, factors that we have to consider in our research, and but of course, we also have to understand that these sources are available, right? It's just on us
That's correct.
to take the initiative and to find them, to identify those voices and to really give them a spotlight and give them the attention that they deserve.
Exactly. 100% correct.
Mm-hmm. So, Brother Myrie, I want to see if maybe you had any further reference materials that you think are important in this discussion that we've been having over the last couple weeks. That, you know, maybe for those who maybe for some reason they just don't know if they're ready for these kinds of discussions. Maybe they're just not sure where to begin. I mean, we're opening the floor for a Q&A, but you know, understandably, there may be some people who just don't know how to ask or what to ask, and so, you know, Brother Myrie, what are some suggestions that you have for people who they're just not sure about where to begin when they're researching, and maybe exactly how to do that kind of research? You know, what can you really say, Brother Myrie, in regards to that?
So with any type of research, so this is just more of a general approach type answer, because no one book is going to give you all of the information that you need. Mm-hmm. And if somebody tells you that, they are not telling you the truth. So right. If you are looking for information, the first thing you want to figure out is, what question are you asking? What specific thing do you want to know? Because if you don't know what information you are looking for, you are willing to just take on any information that comes, and not all information is knowledge. So that's the first thing. Once you've identified what the question is, you want to develop sort of a base level of knowledge. And so what I would recommend with that is checking with encyclopedias. Encyclopedia Britannica is probably one of my favorites, largely because it's a readily available online source that has been vetted by academics. It's not like Wikipedia, where essentially anybody can sign on to Wikipedia and make changes.
True.
While I won't outlaw Wikipedia entirely, because if you check the bottom of most of the pages, they do have references for the sources that are involved in writing what they put in. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't take Wikipedia as the gold standard for certain things, especially when you consider the fact that there are how do I put this? Differences in how certain historical narratives are laid out. So that's the first thing. And sort of to give an idea of what I'm talking about when I say there are differences in the way certain historical narratives are laid out, mm-hmm. I always like to give the example of the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, which I personally call the first conflict in World War II. And if you listen to what some historians will say, they will tell you that the war went from 1936 to 1937, and then ended with Italian colonial power in Ethiopia until 1941.
Right.
But if you listen to other historians, what they will tell you is from 1936 until 1941, the Ethiopians and the Italians fought a war. The Italians won the conventional war in 1937, but hostilities and the conflicts continued until 1941. Italy did not control the entirety of Ethiopia. And so to argue that they had full colonial control is obviously factually incorrect.
Right.
So you have one group of people who says that Ethiopia was colonized from 36 to 41, and another group of people who said that the war actually lasted for 5 years and ended when the British helped the Ethiopians push the Italians out. So understanding that, you have to be careful about the narratives that you're choosing. Look for objective sources where possible. Stay away from message boards. Stay away from, chat forums, and be careful what you learn on TikTok. I just social media is not the place you want to learn things unless, and I say unless, mm-hmm. the website or whatever you're getting it from provides you with sources, additional information, and you know who is providing that information. Because it's very easy to get caught up in a rumor. One that's been passing around right now is the idea that Queen Elizabeth II has passed away. right?
Oh boy.
And it's a rumor that's all over TikTok because it turns out that the Queen of England had coronavirus, but
Mm.
she's not dead.
No, no.
The palace has said very clearly the Queen is alive,
Mm.
but somebody will say something juicy and then that will spread everywhere. So just be careful about where you pick. Try to go for established sources. So know what question you're asking. Look at publicly available, reputable sources.
Yes.
From there, you want to move on to academic journals, because the first thing you want to do is establish a baseline of knowledge. Because if you walk into studying something in depth, like you go to JSTOR and you pull up some articles, if you don't have some of the background knowledge that goes into writing some of these articles, because they do in a way assume that you have a base set of knowledge going into the subject, you won't. You may have some challenges in properly understanding what is in there. Checking with your local bookstore or your local library and asking the librarian about certain books that they have on certain topics is always good. And also do your best before you really get into the research to try and read about the different controversies in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, like the Italian-Ethiopian War, the different camps that might have different opinions on history. Because again, history is just our attempt to create a logical narrative out of a bunch of random happenings in history.
Yep.
So that's what I would say.
Wow. Wow, Brother Myrie, I mean, this is great information. I definitely agree with everything that you have said in regards to being careful about the the sources, understanding that there are different perspectives on the history that we're studying, and with that, there's certain biases which definitely play out in terms of what the writing is saying. And also, of course, with the present digital age that we are in today, we have to be careful about certain things. The structure of social media is such that it's there's more priority on getting attention and less priority on having the right information and presenting, the material in a way that is going to be more comprehensive. Maybe it might be easy to understand at first, but again, you have to be careful about whether or not the information that you're reading is in some way something that can be verified, something that has been verified, and in many cases, you're the one who has to basically take the initiative and do the research and to explore further whether or not what you're seeing in front of you is the facts of what really took place. All of those things I think are important for us to consider, and that's why we do this, Brother Myrie. This is why we have these discussions. That's why we share this information, and every time that we do, I'm very adamant in encouraging people. Don't just share a meme and you call it a day. No, I mean, don't just share a photograph or maybe a few words. I mean, maybe we can take a little bit of time and do a little more. Go the extra mile, because at the end of the day, it pays off. It really helps all of us to get a better understanding of the subjects that we are so interested in learning about. I mean, the groups that I have even here on Facebook, I make it a requirement. If you're sharing information, you're making certain claims, you need to include a source, right? Whether it's a book, an article, a newspaper or magazine, maybe it's a documentary, maybe it's a lecture. Even if it's a quote, sometimes there's times when people are misquoted, right? Sometimes it's someone else who really said that, and sometimes someone completely made it up. I mean, anybody can make a post on Facebook or TikTok or Instagram, YouTube as well. YouTube these days, it tends to be very problematic sometimes. As
Yeah.
we've discussed before with Myrie. People will basically give you a YouTube link as a reference these days, and you know, not to say there's anything inherently wrong with that, but what's most important, like you said, Brother Myrie, is whether or not the information that is being shared on that video, on that post, on that, um, you know, whatever it is, it could be a DM, I don't know, but whether or not that
Yeah.
information is connected to some kind of source material which is relevant to the topic and also which is from a perspective of you know information that can be verified, that is has some background, which is not simply just, hey, I'm just trying to get your attention, or hey, I'm just trying to uh, you know put something in your head, get you to think a certain way, and that's it, right? I think we have to be careful about that.
Absolutely. And it's also a question of logic as well, right? Because there are sometimes people will make claims, and the claims that they make on the surface seem plausible, but then you have to backtrack and look at the logic. Somebody posted a meme recently. There's a couple of things that have kind of been on my mind. One of the things was that somebody posted a meme saying that African warriors in the past had the ability to smell their opponents up to 2 miles away. And I mean, listen, I know that it's kind of a joke about how the Europeans didn't bathe in the 1500s, but I'm sure they didn't smell bad enough to be smelled 2 miles away. And I'm fairly sure. And then they said something in the meme about how when they became slaves, their senses were dulled. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but we were not bloodhounds, right? And so it's illogical. How does that happen in one generation? You go from super smelling to not super. It doesn't make sense. Or you have other questions of the one conversation I had was about whether or not Beethoven was black. And this is a really good exercise in logic. So the first thing we have to figure out is, what do we know about Beethoven's life? Logical question. Who is his father? Who is his mother? Find out that they were both, I believe they were Austrian or something like that. But then you backtrack then you find out about his life, and you find out that his nickname was the Moor. Now, why was his nickname the Moor? You go back into his family history, you find out that his ancestors actually came from Moorish Spain.
Wow.
But they were Jewish. So they were not black Moors. They were just people who lived in Andalusia, and it was kind of a joke that he had this recent heritage, because remember I believe he lived in the 18th and 19th century. That is only 300-400 years removed from where they are. So right. Beethoven in his time would be as far from the collapse of Granada as we would be from Columbus landing in the Americas.
That's
right?
A long time.
So it's a long time, but it's also not a long time, in that he could trace his roots back fairly quickly, right?
Yes.
Because right. So and then of course we're talking about the Spanish Inquisition and all of that stuff, right? So I mean, that is really just not too many generations behind, but it wouldn't be close enough to manifest in the way that he looked, but just the idea that he had this direct lineage, right? And I mean, people make jokes about that today, about their ancestry, even though they may not look like that particular ancestry. So we have proof in his lineage that he isn't black, but if you don't know how to ask the question of why was he being called the Moor when all of his paintings didn't have him looking like what we would associate a Moor looking like, and also understanding that our popular image of what is a Moor is based on post-Reconquista propaganda as well. So it's just this whole situation of knowing how to ask the right questions to determine if the information being provided to you is worth your time to review.
True. And I think you brought up a very important point there, Brother Myrie, which is the fact that there are different media through which we can really address certain questions that we have about history. The fact that there may be some photographs, or maybe there's some paintings, some kind of sketches or images, whatever sort of form they may take. But then, in addition to that, there's the written material. And it's important that we not just rely on one source or another, but we really, just do some kind of a cross-referencing. We take, all of the available evidence into consideration, and we analyze them on that basis, rather than to take a singular source and just kind of run with that. Yeah.
Exactly. And we also have to understand that people in the past were just as prone, if not more prone, because of the amount of information we now have available to us, as people today, to make errors when they were discussing history. So somebody in 19th century France who's writing about the history of ancient Egypt may make some of the same mistakes that we would make if we had the exact same amount of knowledge and the same access that that person did. Today, if I'm not sure about what somebody's telling me about ancient Egypt, I can hop on my phone or my computer, throw in something on Google Scholar, pull down an article from somebody who knows more than me about the subject. Back then, it wasn't that easy. So anybody could write whatever they wanted, and because people couldn't just hop on and get that information in seconds, and books were very expensive, oftentimes there wasn't a way for them to be able to verify those details. Right?
That's another thing. We have to understand, I think, the level of information that was available at certain points in time and certain places. I think that even relates to the discussions about the slave trades, right? It's funny to me. It's very interesting that you had certain times where Europeans, even the very people who were on the slave ships, who were doing the trading with the indigenous people on the continent, didn't have a very good idea about where these enslaved people were coming from. I found that to be very fascinating, because it's like, you mean to tell me for so many years you're coming here to this place and you have no idea about, the people who you're dealing with? I mean, that just doesn't, to our, kind of in hindsight, right, to our understanding in the modern day, that just does not make any sense. But again, like you said, Brother Myrie, we have to understand that the perspectives that we are, exploring, through the lens of these individuals who lived in this time period, it's not the same as our perspective today, and our ability, right, to be able to do certain research, to be able to. The fact of the matter is that our world today is so very interconnected. There are certain barriers that were in place in those times which don't exist today, right? For example, language barriers. It's easy for me to, if I find a document that is written in French, to basically have it transcribed, copy paste to Google Translate, right? Or Yandex for those who use that, the Russian program, and basically, translate it to English, and just like that, you're good to go, right? But in those days, things were different. There were certain limitations in the, of course, the perspective and the knowledge base that certain people had in certain places and certain time periods, and we have to understand that.
Absolutely. And there's a great story actually about this town. I believe it's in Germany. So they had this skull that they called the skull of this dragon, and there was this whole big thing where they had a big statue made of what this dragon could have looked like and all of that. It turned out that the skull belonged to a woolly rhinoceros. It was a fossil, but this whole village for how many hundreds of years thought that this was the head of a dragon that they found, right? And that's just an example of people who didn't have all that necessary information. The whole discipline of paleontology is less than 200 years old. Like, think about that. You know, imagine that this, you know, we all grew up with dinosaurs and woolly mammoths and all of this other stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But the whole discipline of being able to gather information about these ancient creatures isn't even, you know, older than doesn't even start until the 19th century. So, you know, when we're looking at the information as we research it now, we have to understand that, one, the knowledge that we have today is imperfect because history is an ongoing process, but also that the information that people had then may also be flawed because maybe they wrote this down 40 years after it happened and it is a secondhand account. Mm-hmm. You know? And so, you know, we definitely have to approach these things with that type of logic. And again, also checking to see what the agenda of the person providing that information is. That's right. I had a big conversation with a colleague of mine about the Black Hebrew Israelites and their whole thing about everybody in the Americas, Black people in the Americas are really the original Jews, and how, you know, if you're from Jamaica, you're from this tribe, and if you're from Trinidad, you're from this tribe, and if you're from South Carolina, you're from this tribe. And to their credit, they do spend a lot of time reading and memorizing biblical verses and learning about the meanings of certain words and all of that. They spend a lot of time doing that. Right. But all of that is undercut and discredited by the fact that they make this argument that has absolutely no proof when we're talking about the origins of Black people in the Americas. And, you know, and then you ask, okay, well, what is the purpose of them doing that? And that, in the end, is to divorce them from, one, their relationship with Africans, and two, to legitimize their claim to what is in the Bible. But then when you learn the history and all that, it sort of comes together from all of these different ideas. I'm kind of scattered right now, but my main point is to bring it all back to center, is that you also have to look at the agenda of the person that is providing you this information and what ideologies underpin the narrative that they are giving you. Because they may be giving you good information, but the way that they are presenting it is flawed.
Yes, that's absolutely right. You know, when we look at the history of African societies, again, we have to acknowledge that there is an issue of perspective, because a lot of the records that we have come from, of course, Europeans, and in some times also Arabs. And, you know, for the majority of this period in which they were writing, there were certain prejudices which were built, and, you know, so there were certain stories that came out of the time in which they were writing, in which there were descriptions of African people as cannibalistic. You know, just broad generalizations. I'm sorry. There were certain, you know, fallacies about African people, of course, generally, being very big on, you know, human sacrifice and, you know, basically a godless society, and, you know, the list goes on and on and on. And you have to have that discernment, really, to be able to acknowledge that, first of all, this person who is writing this narrative, this is somebody who may have learned some things from somebody else, you know, who looks like them, who has the same, you know, religion, who has the same culture, you know, who has a lot of the same interests. And because of those commonalities, they more readily agree with certain perspectives and less so with others. So even when they're presented with information which doesn't necessarily, you know, connect with whatever it is that they have learned previously, sometimes it's hard for them to process that and to acknowledge this as, well, probably the truth. Right? And we have the same problems today, like you pointed out, Brother Myrie. We still have people today who, um, they have certain agendas, whatever those may be, which are, sometimes given priority over what is the fact. And it's even
Right.
when you present the
Absolutely.
hard evidence to them, it's like they just can't seem to understand, how what they previously knew and what other people have been telling them is maybe not so much the truth. So
Right.
that's important for us to understand, definitely.
And the biggest challenge too is that sometimes the information that you find out does challenge your worldview.
Yes.
And so you have to be willing to accept, the study of history can be very humbling if you are willing to accept that the information that you will find may not always jive with your personal worldview.
That's right.
I always like to go with the great example that I always give is whether or not Cleopatra was black. And I'm sure we've talked about this before.
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea of, well, Cleopatra was this black queen and she's been whitewashed, and that whole conversation surrounding her existence. And then when you do the research and you find out that she was Greek, you're like, oh, now I look stupid because for all these years I've just been saying that she's a black woman, and now I'm presented with this information. Now you have a question of fighting with your ego or fighting with your desire to be correct.
That's right.
Your ego says, well, no, just reject the information, forget the cognitive dissonance, and we're just going to go with my same argument. And I had this conversation with someone a few years ago, and she basically said, well, why are you arguing about, Cleopatra's race and saying that she was really, a Macedonian Greek woman? And I said, well, because she was. And I said, if you look at a family tree, which is a bit more like a vertical stick, you'll see that there really wasn't a lot of mingling with peoples other than their own, even outside of their own family. And then I explained to her that, and she's like, well, and this is where the question comes up. And she says, well, so many of our figures in history have been whitewashed and they've been painted to be a different color and their, race is ignored and all of this. So why can't we have one? And I said, well, what's the point in continuing this argument over false history by focusing on false history? Tell the story correctly, right? And, remembering that Egypt has 3,000 years of history with whole dynasties of black queens. Do we really need to focus on one individual who is, like, why are we arguing over one person who is not black just so that we can have points on the board?
And someone who is not so, I mean, we're talking about someone who basically signaled the end of the, the entire nation. Like you said, Brother Mark,
exactly.
why not focus on the thousands of years of prosperity? Even the queens, which were much more significant, to that history, to the development of African societies and the society, particularly in ancient Egypt. I think that definitely is important for us to consider.
Right, exactly, and that's the thing. We need to be able to challenge our own biases while we are challenging the biases of others. Often on my TikTok, I get people saying, most recently I did a video on some of my favorite sabers from around Africa, and somebody said something to the effect of, "Oh, well, all of these came from Arabs," and ignoring the fact that some of these swords have been around longer than Arabs have been using curved sabers, it falls back to that whole question of everything good in Africa came from somewhere else. And you have to be able to simultaneously challenge that by proving that no, Africa did produce a lot of amazing things, but also at the same time being willing to accept that there are some things that Africans adopted from outside of the continent.
Right.
Which is perfectly.
And even to that point, acknowledging that it's not even necessarily a bad thing. There's not a good and a bad to that. It's not that, okay, there's something wrong with the fact that there were certain influences from outside the continent. I mean, that in itself is not, you know, a negative thing, right? Um,
Right.
because the same thing we can find in other regions of the world, right? Europe as well. Everyone likes to talk about like the Renaissance period, but they don't like to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the kind of intellectual growth which was taking place during this time period was also the result of influences from outside of Europe.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You can look at a whole bunch of things, and the mathematics. I had a whole argument with somebody today about whether or not algebra was brought to Europe by Arabs, and their argument is, well, it was created by the Greeks. The Greeks created everything, and I said the first problem right there is assuming that one group of people are responsible for everything.
Yeah.
Knowledge is a collective human endeavor.
Yes.
In fact, and I explained to this person, I said, well, first off, algebra is an Arabic word.
Yep.
That should be the first cue. And the second cue that you should pick up on is that algebra was the conceptual foundation of algebra is actually Babylonian. But also understanding that Greeks, who were very good at creating mathematical concepts and analyzing all these things, there's a great story about this Greek philosopher who used the Pythagorean theorem to design an entire aqueduct. It's phenomenal. Digging through this mountain. Maybe we can talk about it later.
Oh, yeah.
But
that sounds interesting.
But saying that this individual, that this civilization acquired this knowledge from another civilization and improved on it, as you said, is not inherently bad. Right? It doesn't take anything away from any of their accomplishments. They still had to sit down and do the calculations. Right? You could argue the same thing about pillars. Pillars in Greece didn't appear until after they appeared in Egypt. In fact, early pillars that were used to hold up buildings, in ancient Greece, in various city-states, were designed after, even in the decorative style, not exactly the same, but similar to what the Egyptians had been doing for centuries before. Does that mean that the Parthenon is any less amazing? No. Does it mean that anything the Greeks have created afterwards in designing their own different styles of pillars, the way that they actually stack them from different pieces of stone and all of that, does that take away from that? No, it doesn't. It just means that civilization encountered another civilization that had a good idea, and they decided to apply it to their own cultural context. The same way that Africans would do the same thing abroad. But then that comes to the whole conversation of, well, Africans didn't bring anything abroad, or Africans were all living in mud huts. But so were Europeans until the 1500s. I don't see the issue here.
That's the facts. And you cannot argue with the facts, Brother Myrie. But I think that the issue is that disconnect. The fact that the prejudices, the biases that people have, are in some way, shape, or form kind of preventing them from really opening up their minds and taking the time to really challenge these prior understandings that they've had based on the limited knowledge that was given to them, and also, really to research some of the perspectives which basically exist outside of that.
Yes.
I mean, recently, what I've been reading as of late is the book by Sheikh Anta Diop. The book is The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality. And in this book, he talks about the time in which he was writing the birth of Egyptology, how it was essentially predicated upon this hypothesis that Africa produced nothing. And that Egypt was basically the result of some, exterior group of people and exterior impetus. And so everything that came after that was basically an attempt to deny the African heritage of ancient Egypt. And so Diop really gets into the psychology behind this. He talks about. I mean, I'm surprised that in his time. I mean, we're talking about when this book was written. It would have been like the 50s, because it was basically the book itself was published later on, but it was a collection of his writings, in prior decades. And so, I mean, it's again. So another thing that's important, I think, is to understand that there were people who came before us who have done some of this work in challenging these misconceptions, right? We're not alone in this. It's not just, well, you know, all of this pressure, all this burden on us today. We can also refer to those scholars who came before us, and really to kind of build on the work that they did in helping to point out some of the, of course, again, those misconceptions that we are so familiar with today.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think that is very important to realize as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that I've come to learn in the years that I've really been a bit more serious about doing research is that the more I learn, mm-hmm. the more I realize that I don't know anything. I mean, we're sitting here talking about all of these facts and this history and this and that and other. The more I learn about these subjects, the more I realize that there are things that I don't know. And
yeah.
and then the crazy part is there are things I cannot know.
True.
That's the part that gets you,
mm-hmm.
right? Like I was thinking about a great example I can give is the destruction of Carthage, right?
Mm-hmm.
That city-state that was so influential in the Mediterranean for 200 some odd years. Rome's worst enemy. Punic Wars 1 and 2, and then 3, and all of this other stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then basically after it was burned and destroyed and Romanized, there's very little left of that society, aside from one book that the Romans took that they ended up using to improve their agriculture. I think it's called, was it Hanno's 28 Principles or something like that?
Right.
It was one of the only books.
You can continue.
But it was one of the only books I can remember, at least, that was brought from Carthage, mm-hmm. translated from Phoenician to Latin, and then actually used by the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, there's really very little that we know beyond what we've learned from their neighbors and people who have encountered them. Right? Like, what was the day-to-day life like for your average Carthaginian citizen? We have clues, but we will never know in the same detail that we will know about a Roman citizen of the same era.
And the question
we just won't know.
And the question is, but Myrie, why is that? Because again, like we said, the perspective, right? I mean, there's that famous saying that history is written by who?
Yeah, the victors, of course.
Right. And in that situation, who were the victors? It would have been the Romans. And so,
right.
Again, I mean, it all ties into that discussion of, how can we, really do this research? How can we learn about the history of, the things that had taken place, that were done to, our ancestors, and how they resisted, or how they, were involved in some of these activities, some of these very dark periods of our history. So,
mm-hmm.
I mean, it really calls us, I think, Brother Myrie, to a conversation about not just understanding the perspectives, the differences of perspectives in the historical record, but also understanding that as researchers, we too bring different perspectives to the research.
Absolutely.
And this is why I always advocate that we need to be more united as a people in really, putting these stories together in order to understand what was taking place. I can be doing research, and I could be doing the research a certain way and presenting it a certain way based on my perspective, based on my understanding, but I don't have the full picture, right?
Right.
There are things that I haven't learned in my research that you, Brother Myrie, you have spent a very long time exploring. And so I think that's something we have to understand, that the more I think that we come together, the more that we get into the habit of collaborating and really even challenging one another on these subjects. Because originally, of course, the Research Rumble, we wanted this to be a debate, but since it is just the very first one, we were just able to do it as a discussion. But
Yeah.
at another point in the future, hopefully we can have more engagement, and it'll be on a level in which those who are able to join in teams and to present their side of the subject,
Mhm.
challenge other people who are able to come together in teams and present their side of the subject, and based on that interaction, we can come from that with an understanding which is more informed, right? Which is based on not just one perspective, or one view or one accepted side of the history, but based on multiple perspectives, and and so that's I think the goal, that our research
Absolutely.
is one that is able to bring us together as a people and help us to make progress in the future.
I agree 100%. And I think lately I've been trying to learn a bit more, or learn more different perspectives about certain periods in history. I spend a lot of time avoiding, this is relevant, I spend a lot of time avoiding learning about things from the perspective of the Confederates, for example, when looking at the American Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and if you think about it, why would I? Right? Team slavery versus team not slavery.
Right.
Not really hard to pick a side on that.
Yeah.
But
it's kind of a given.
right. But then you ask the question, well, how do their perspectives impact the way that things are done today? Why did we have the United Daughters of the Confederacy? Why was there's this whole push to create the lost cause narrative? Why are there so many Confederate monuments when they lost the war and they were the enemies of the country that now, of the country that they existed? Right? I mean, if you think about it, England doesn't have statues of Napoleon sitting in Trafalgar Square. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Why, what else can I say? Like, in Mamluk Egypt, or in Egypt, you're not going to see statues of Genghis Khan. Like you're just you're not going to see that
in the museums, right?
So well, exactly. I mean, in Israel, you're not going to see any statues of a guy with a mustache, if you understand what I mean. So the question is, well, why would they do that? And so I've been spending a lot of time listening to discussions and interviews. There's some really great channels on YouTube where you actually get to listen to interviews done in the 1920s and 1930s from actual veterans of the American Civil War. Remembering that the 1920s and 1930s are only 50 or 60 years after the American Civil War. And if you put that into perspective, we still have World War II veterans.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Mm-hmm. So these are people who were there fighting in the war, some of them who were slaves, and you can actually hear what they think. But then when you listen to what the Confederate soldiers would be saying, and then you compare that to what the enslaved people are saying, you can see how one group of people, especially after segregation, will have one view of things, and another group of people will have another view of things. Somebody said something interesting today about perspectives as we're talking about history. And they said that there are people in the United States who genuinely, who after the Civil War ended, specifically we're talking in the South, whose families' narratives, whose family history and narratives about the American Civil War isn't about this great struggle for justice and human freedom, but it's the story of how they lost everything. Imagine you are a wealthy plantation owner, right? You don't humanize Black people at all. They're commodities to you. And the war is over. And now you are forced to give up all of these slaves who represent, in today's money, hundreds of thousands of dollars of your value. Mm-hmm. Your farm no longer has anybody to work on your farm. The land values plummet. And now you are sitting in this house where your family is living maybe half as wealthy or a third as wealthy as they did when you had your land and your slaves. And now all you can tell your grandchildren, who are the grandparents of today's adults, about how much you lost everything and how losing all of these, these slaves who were supposed to be your happy servants, forgetting that when you ask the slaves, they were pretending to be happy so that they wouldn't die.
That's right.
And this narrative now carries on to today's adults, who then may have that same conversation with their children. And then you learn about, and I learned this recently, that some people still have artifacts from that era in their houses that they won't give to museums or they won't give to archives. One person was talking about how their family had a bill of sale, or not a bill of sale, but an inventory of the slaves that were kept on their family's property. It was from the early 19th century. It had the names, where they were from, who they were bought from, who they were sold to, and this could help, African Americans, for example, find members of their family. But they refused to turn these over to an archive because they want to. There's a few reasons. One of them, I think, is that they don't want to. Is the guilt. They don't want to publicly be associated with owning slaves while still holding on to this document. There is that family history. Oh, well, this belonged to my family, and look at how neat this is, and not connecting to the human factor of what they have, which goes to my last 2 points. One of them being that some people are just racist, and this is the only way that they can continue to own or wield power over Black people. And another is they don't understand that these are human. They can't empathize. That's the word I want to use. Because intellectually, I think they understand that these are people in these books, but they don't empathize with the fact that these names in this book that they have are directly related to people who are alive today who may still be looking for those family members.
Yep.
So, multiple reasons for that. There are some people who have just had these things in their houses. There was
they're just not sure what to do.
Well, exactly. Like there was a Black upholsterer who got this 200-year-old chair. I think he was in Louisiana. And the family wanted it to get reupholstered because it was an old antique. Mm-hmm. Do you know what he found when he opened the chair?
Oh, the cotton chair.
Human hair.
Oh, human hair. Wow.
That chair was stuffed with hair from the shaved heads of African slaves. Mm. I watched the video myself of him opening it up.
Yes. As a matter of fact, I think I do remember that, seeing that video. And that was...
right.
It was very disturbing, It
is.
How can someone put this thing together and you're comfortable using it? Let's just sit on a chair that's full of hair. I mean, how
well,
can you see that?
And that's the wild part, because I don't think that they understood they either didn't understand or they didn't empathize. Mm-hmm. Because empathy is something that you get taught in life. You don't just have it. Mm-hmm. Right? They didn't empathize with the fact that these were human beings, human people that went through all of this to create these things that you have. Right. There's one individual who was talking about his grandfather was present at a lynching, and he kept a piece of, I think it was a man's T-shirt, the man's shirt that they had killed and burned. He kept a copy of the shirt as a souvenir because they used to hand them out at the end of a lynching.
Wow.
And the person who was talking about it says, well, I don't want to give too much information because I don't want to vilify my grandfather. I'm like, he vilified himself when he was at the lynching. And people are so worried about being connected to these things that were just horrible. Mm-hmm. And so instead of doing the decent thing, which is the only way that you can properly divorce yourself from that history is to share the information and demonstrate that you are not the same as those individuals. Mm-hmm. But going back to my previous point about perspectives, which I went through all of this to illustrate, mm-hmm. is that in order to understand part of why things are the way they are when we are studying history, we have to be willing to look at perspectives of people we really do not want to listen to.
Yeah.
because
People you don't
before
agree with.
exactly
Yeah.
because before going through that whole exercise of trying to learn about the fallout of the Civil War from the perspective of the other side,
Mm-hmm.
I had no desire to even care about what any of these people thought. Because if you were on team slavery, that is all I needed to know. I didn't need to know anything else. And that is the first mistake when you are studying history.
Yep.
You need to try to know as much as you can in order to be able to form an accurate narrative.
Yep.
Why so many people would even bother joining the army to fight for the South if many of these people didn't even own slaves. And all of that is connected to these questions of superiority and social class and maintaining a way of life that they didn't even benefit from. And
you wouldn't know all of that unless you did the due diligence to, to really examine things from the other side to see, okay,
yes,
what were some of the thinking that went into their decision making, right?
exactly.
What was some of the propaganda? What was some of the that information which they were fed? What are some ways that they were conditioned? All that's important. And just because they tend to kind of present a certain narrative, I think that can be a turnoff. But the conversation doesn't have to end there, right? There's also room for us to really dig further and try and find out, okay, what are some of the reasons why you believe what you believe? For those people who agree with that side of the argument, or who told you that, or where did you get that information? What are some of the books that you've been reading? Maybe take some time to find those books and to read them and to figure out, okay, what are those books saying? Who wrote those books, and where do those people get their information? And I think that's that's the best way, like you said, Brother Myrie, for us to get a complete picture, to get a complete understanding of the subject that we're dealing with. Whatever it may be, whether it's about
exactly.
The slave trades, or it's about the Confederacy or the Civil War, or maybe it's a subject which will be the next research rumble about feminism, or some other subject that we tend to discuss very often in this day and age. So I think these are definitely some very important things for us to consider as we research, as we explore these different subjects of our history.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Brother Myrie, it's so good to have you joining us. It's so good that you were able to share with us some of your knowledge, some of your background. I don't think we've had any comments. I'm just checking the thread here to see if we've had any particular questions that we can address as we wrap up our Q&A session. And no, I don't see any so far. But again, for those who are just joining us, this is Black Researchers United. My name Omri Koch, and I'm joined here with Adam Myrie, who is a very excellent researcher. Brother Myrie, he does some great work with the Historical African Martial Arts Association. So be sure to follow his various pages and platforms. He also has a TikTok where he is very active these days. So, definitely support Brother Myrie and the work that he's done. And once again, I want to show you Brother Myrie's book here, Songs of the Sunya. Get it today. It's hot off the press, and he has another book that is also coming out very soon. So again, we've been here with our research rumble. Our next rumble, hopefully it's going to be in October. We want to address the topic of feminism versus womanism. Some of you may be familiar with feminism and not so much womanism, but we have plenty of time. Definitely seek out some reference materials if you want to join us in that discussion when it comes. And again, for those of you who want to join our panel, you just need to send us an email. The email to bru@afrologia.org. That is bru@afrologia.org. You can just, just kind of introduce yourself, give us a little background on who you are, maybe a sample of the reference materials that you'll be using for that discussion, and we'll be more than happy to accommodate your presentation. So once again, this has been a very excellent discussion. I want to thank you, Brother Myrie, for joining us the past few weeks. And if there are any other questions that we, for some reason or another, were not able to get to, feel free to leave them in the comments, and we will address them at a later point in time. All right. Once again, this has been Black Researchers United, and I hope you will join us again next time for another research discussion. Take care, everyone.